Different format today than normal. So, a couple things before we get started. So remember that on Friday you have reading number 2 due. It is a rather large one, so again, try not to put it off till Thursday night. If you haven't chipped away at it a little bit already, you want to start doing that. It will be helpful to you. All right, so today I am going to try to cover everything that's in that unit 1, or reading 1, excuse me. Right? From today. So, what is important for you guys today is to be kind of locked in, because you don't have reading notes on this, right? So, one thing that might be helpful to you is, as we go through, you're going to notice that I'm going to try to cover every question and every kind of bullet point on this reading. Right? So, having that out in front of you and also kind of, taking notes will probably be helpful to you as well. Right? So, I'm trying to kind of we have a lot of information to go over in this unit. I feel like there's some things we can do quickly, other things that need that kind of backup of the reading. This is one of those things that I think we can do quickly. But here's what I need from you. We got to be kind of locked in to fully do it. Because everything that we're about to explore, right, becomes a central foundation for all the things in this unit we're going to be talking about next week. We talk about some very famous presidents next week. We're going to be talking about the lead up to World War I. Right, next week, things like that. So this information is that foundation to understand those things. So really be locked in. Same rules apply today as any class with a class participation grade, right? It's all like normal. But here's what I want you to do at the end of this, right? In the next couple days, if you feel like this works, right, give me some feedback. If you feel like I don't understand it as well as when we read it and then do the class, right? Give me that feedback as well. Because if it does work, right, especially coming up on the end of the year here, there might be some other areas where we can kind of skim down your reading a little bit and kind of replace it with some in-class stuff as well. But only if it works, because I will still expect this, you to have mastery of this material when we come to exam time and things like that. Okay, so be honest with that. So today, we're going to kick off our 7th unit, which is pretty exciting because there's only 9 all year, right? And this is going to take us all the way up until spring breaks. This is one of our largest units of the year, right? Has a lot of depth to it. But what I also find is it's a lot of material that I think students start to connect to a little bit easier. Because this is where you start to see the formation of modern America, right? When we look at the development of a country that resembles one that you can recognize a little bit more than maybe what it's looked like in the past and things like that. So today we're going to do that, and we're going to introduce kind of the first topic, which is this concept of American imperialism. Try to understand the causes and the effects. But before we do, let's start, as we always do, with our breakdown of the big theme that the College Board gives us, the big picture. And I gave it to you there on your note sheet, right? So from 1890 to 1945 is what we're studying this month. All right, so let's start. Why 1890? Because that's actually overlapping a little bit what we just got done studying. What do you think, Dale? That's going to start in 1898. You're right? That's an important kind of war, and it's part of this American imperialism we're going to talk about, right? Well, let's kind of go back and remember where we started our last unit, right? I showed you this map when we were looking at Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. And what did we use this map to decide about the concept of a frontier in America? What's this map prove? Because what was a frontier again that we talked about Frederick Jackson Turner that he described? Nasser, what was it?
Oh, we talked about frontier as being the free land, desirable way to go to, but with this map it's decreased significantly.
Yeah, so the frontier is basically gone, right? So 1890 is that idea where the frontier has disappeared, right? Remember, that's what he talked about. Right, so Frederick Jackson Turner said, and now 4 centuries from the discovery of America, at the end of the 100 years' life under the Constitution, the frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history. Now why? Why did Frederick Jackson Turner say that? It's because what did he say was important about having all this free land throughout our history? What did it do for us again? Jacob, what did he say?
It helps individualism and independence just because people had to take care of things on their own.
Absolutely, right? So that free land always kind of created that independent spirit of America, which then spawned us to have value in democracy and things like that. So he's saying, well, now by 1890, the frontier is gone. Now, it also overlaps with the Battle of Wounded Knee, the last of kind of the massacres of the Native Americans in the Western Plains as well, which is kind of the symbolic event of the closing of the frontier as well. So what he's saying is, well, now that that's gone, now that we don't have all this free land, we're probably going to see a significant change as a people, right? And he's not wrong there. So where his view of the West was a little bit simplistic, he's not wrong when you look at what we're about to embark on, right? And where this unit ends then is 1945. So why? Why 1945? Nick, why?
End of World War II.
Exactly, right? And even though we haven't studied it yet, what happens to the United States, you think, as the end of World War II that maybe wasn't there before? Kylie, what do you think?
It becomes a major world power.
Exactly, right? So this is where the United States kind of steps into this role as like a superpower, right? A world power, right? And that's a relatively new development in American history that came out of World War II. So in other words, we start at 1890, where we have this guy saying, hey, we're about to change, and we end with that significant change of the United States really being a modern superpower at the end of World War II. So we are really trying to figure out is, well, how? What caused that change? What developments were there to that change? So that's what we're going to look at. So let's turn this into a couple questions, right? So when you look at all of these topics that we're going to cover between now and spring break, it's a lot, right? In reality, several of these topics I could teach a whole semester on. I could teach a whole semester on the Great Depression and World War II, right? But we're going to now kind of condense it in. So we got to figure out a couple of questions to use as a framework. So let's read this together and see what questions we can create that we know we're going to have to answer here. It starts with this: an increasingly pluralistic United States. All right? Circle that word, pluralistic, and let's define it. What does a pluralistic United States mean? What does it mean to be a pluralistic country? What do you think, Dale?
So like increasingly diversified.
Absolutely, right? So the idea of a pluralistic society is one where you can have a diverse number of races, religions, ideas that all can kind of coincide in one society. So in other words, they're saying by 1890 the United States is becoming increasingly pluralistic. Well, why? What did we learn last unit that proves the United States was becoming increasingly pluralistic? Audrey, what do you think?
There was a lot of immigration from different areas.
Exactly, right? All those new immigrants, right, with new kind of cultural norms, language, religion, things like that. So yeah, so we know that's happening. So the first thing we're going to ask is, between 1890 and 1945, how does the United States become even more pluralistic than beyond just that new immigration? So that's our first question that we're going to explore. And we're going to look for that theme, right? How does the United States become a continually more diverse nation between 1890 and 1945, right? All right, so there's our first question. The second then, goes on, right? So this increasingly pluralistic United States faced profound domestic and global challenges. All right, so what's the obvious two questions we're going to ask with that we need to understand? What do you think, Tom?
What domestic challenges were there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so what are the major challenges between 1890 and 1945? What are the big domestic challenges the country is going to have to face? What are the big international challenges the country is going to have to face, right? So there's our next two questions that we're going to look at over this month, right? Now, as a result of these challenges, the country then is going to debate the proper degree of government activism. What's that mean, do you think, then? As a result of these challenges, what's it mean people are going to call for, do you think? Allison, what do you think?
Probably reform.
Yeah, what kind of reform?
The political structure.
Yeah, because what did we just learn about the government of the United States in the unit prior to this? Nasser, what did we learn?
It wasn't very effective in like making legislation or doing it.
Yeah, it didn't do much, right? So in other words, what we're going to see as a result of some major challenges between 1890 and 1945, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to say, we want a government to do more now, right? To be larger, more powerful, more involved, right? But if there's a debate, what else does that mean? Is everyone going to be on board? So what do you think?
Some people are going to argue the opposite.
Exactly, right? So we're going to see some back and forth in this time period, right? So what we want to figure out is, right, what results from the debate about the American government in this time period, right? Because it's not a straight line as you're going to see throughout this time period. On top of that, they're also going to, they sought to define its international role. What's that mean? What has dominated American foreign policy from the beginning of this class till now? Ben, what do you think?
It's like hands off, stay isolated.
Absolutely, right? And who kind of laid that groundwork for it? Yeah, George Washington, right? Remember his farewell address? This whole idea of not having alliances, right? Trying to stay somewhat unattached from all of these wars and conflicts around the world. Well, if we're seeking to define our international role, what's it say about that tradition of unattached kind of neutrality? Tom, what do you think?
It's going to change. We're starting to rejecting ourselves into the world.
Absolutely, right? So we're going to start to see some drastic changes in foreign policy as well. So these last two, as a result of these kind of major challenges, right? What results from the debate about what our government should look like? What are the results of that? And what results from this kind of debate to define what our role in the world will be, our foreign policy, right? So that is what we're going to talk about. So when we look at this, we've got, now about 5 questions we really need to answer, right? What creates a more pluralistic United States during this time period? What are the major domestic challenges they face? What are the major international challenges that are faced? And how do these challenges, right? What results from the debate of what our government should be like in the midst of these challenges? What is the result of the debate of what our foreign policy should be like in the midst of these challenges? So those 5 questions, by March, when we're dreaming of spring break and warmer weather and all that kind of stuff, right? Those are the ones that we have to answer and answer well. Does that make sense? So as we go through, we're going to cover a lot of topics to do all of that, right? So any one of these topics could be a unit unto itself, right? But now this is our through line, right? So how do these show the story of a more pluralistic United States developing? How do these show the story of massive domestic challenges facing the country, massive international challenges facing the country, and a debate of what our government should look like, both here at home as well as abroad, right? So that's what we have to look for in each one of these topics that we go through. Make sense? All right, well, let's start then, right? So our first topic then, with that as our framework, is American imperialism. So we're going to study a pretty short period of time today, 1890 to 1902. That's it, 12 years of history, right, is all we're going to look at. And we're going to look at this concept of American imperialism. So before we do, we have to make sure we all have a basis for this. What's imperialism mean? What's it mean to be an imperialist nation? Ben, what's that mean?
Like you're seeking to spread out your borders, take over other countries.
Okay, good, right? So yeah, maybe seeking to spread your influence on other countries. Well, how do you influence other countries? What are ways to be imperialist, right? What do you think, Megan?
You could conquer them.
Yeah, you could just go and set up camp there, right, and conquer them. What else could you do to have kind of an imperialist influence over another country? What do you think, Seth?
Use religion.
Okay, yeah, right. So you could spread religion, right? Missionary works often are used. Tom, what else?
You could become an important part of the economy there.
Yeah, absolutely, right? You have kind of economic influence over that nation is another way to do it. So all of these are examples of imperialism. You're exactly right. Because imperialism is defined as this idea of the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or nation over foreign countries, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies, right? So, yeah, you can have economic authority. You can actually make a colony out of them, right? You can put a government in place for them, right? These are all different forms of imperialism. But at the core, it's this idea that one nation is extending some sort of authority over others. Lands maybe outside of the traditional borders of those nations. So today, we're going to look at how the United States gets involved in this game. Now, the United States is kind of late to the game. Because who are the masters of imperialism by the 1890s? What countries? Harrison, what do you think?
China.
Well, China's being imperialized, but they're not imperialists, right? Carly, what do you think? Yeah, Britain is a huge one. Justice, what else?
France.
Yeah, France, right? Who else, Nasser?
Spain.
Yeah, Spain. Who else, Nick?
The Dutch.
Yeah, the Dutch, right? The Belgians, the Germans, right? So by the 1890s, Europe has been at this game for a long time. And the United States is going to say, we want some of that. Now, Europe was focusing on places like Asia, Africa, right? Places like that. The United States is going to be a little different. right? But at the same time, there's going to be some overlap with European imperialism as well. So what we want to figure out then is why the United States will get involved in this game. So why by the 1890s? Europe's been doing it for years. So what is it about the 1890s that will cause the United States to collectively take this on? Because like Ben said earlier, it kind of goes against the traditional belief that the United States is kind of a isolated, unattached nation, right, throughout much of our history. Spencer, what do you think?
Well, maybe like a surge in industrialization and like advanced technology.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very much connected to those themes from last class, or last unit, right? So let's explore that. So let's understand the causes. All right, so first off, let's kind of map American imperialism, right? So we're going to focus on a couple hot spots of American imperialism, right? One we're going to focus on is the island of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the southern tip of Florida, right? Another one we're going to focus on are the island chains of Hawaii, right? Which we're going to look at what brought them into the fold of the United States in the 1890s. Then we're going to kind of focus on the Philippines, way over here, Southeast Asia. Then we're going to focus on China a little bit as well. Right? So those are the four areas of American imperialism. But however, notice that those, I'm just using those as symbols, right? As there's a lot more going on with American imperialism. A lot of smaller island chains, right? Things like that. Even Alaska can kind of get folded in as we bought that in the 1860s as well. So we're just going to focus today as good pieces of evidence of American imperialism. Cuba, Hawaii, the Philippines, and China is what we're going to focus on today. All right, so let's start, first off, by understanding the causes. So why now? Why by the 1890s is the United States going to do this? Right? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Right? There's a social reason, there's a political reason, and there's an economic reason. So the first one is that social belief in controlling lesser peoples. Well, why? From our last unit we talked about, what examples were there of a social belief of controlling those that were lesser? Right? What do you think, Megan?
The political machine of political losses.
Absolutely. How they kind of used new immigrants, things like that. What would be another example? Jacob, what else do you think?
Just the entire idea of social Darwinism.
Yeah, right?
What happened was because they were more fit than others.
Perfect. That dominant theme of social Darwinism. And then there's one more. What else? Alice, what do you think?
Trying to organize the Indians.
Yeah, the Native Americans, right? Absolutely. Right? This idea that you had the ability to control and make a dependent upon you a whole race of people, like what was done to the Native Americans in the West. So when we look at that, right, this idea extends perfectly into imperialism. It's not a big stretch, right, by the 1890s, as Americans have been controlling and exerting their influence over Native Americans now for the better part of the century. Right? That belief in social Darwinism that led to a number of things, especially the dominance of the industrial class, the political machines of this time period. So that belief that races are just like species. They're always struggling to compete, to advance. So a lot of people are going to apply that, well, imperialism is the same thing. If we're the superior species, right, we have this right to just go and be the fittest outside of our borders as well. So there's kind of the social movements from that last unit that we're talking about that would cause this. Well, there's also political movements. So what do we notice, right? So imperialism is going to be seen as a great way to stabilize domestic politics as well as grow international power. Well, why? What sort of conflict was there domestically that we learned from last class? Why would you say that this was not a stable political system? What sort of conflict did we see was happening by the 1890s in America based on our last unit? Who was unhappy? Brittany, who's one
A
group?
lot of the workers, seemed like
Absolutely, all the labor union strikes, things like that. Seth, who else?
The West, like the farmers.
Yeah, the populists and all the agricultural movements that led to the populist movement by the 1890s. So what would be the argument then? So we have all these internal debates. People are not agreeing, right? Labor unions not agreeing with industrialists. Farmers not agreeing with Eastern bankers, right? We could also add into that the feeling of African Americans, the conflict between Native Americans as well, right? So if we look at all of those conflicts, why would someone say, hey, I know how to solve all of the internal conflict. Go fight a war. Go fight a war against a foreign power. Why? Why does somebody believe that that would work? Nick, what do you think?
Well, it kind of like brings the people together to like back the country as well.
Absolutely, right? So it kind of papers over those internal debates as to try to get people together. And that was the thought process, was that that would be a way to end those kind of internal debates. Unify the country that would be otherwise divided for the sake of war. Now on top of that, there's also the political belief that if you want to be a big player on the world scene, you have to be an imperialist. And the most famous guy that came up with that theory is this guy, Alfred Thayer Mahan. There he is right there. Right? So Alfred Thayer Mahan in 1890 was worked at the United States Naval War College in Washington, D.C., and he wrote a book titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, in which his central thesis was that all the great powers in human history, all the world powers in human history, had one thing in common. They controlled the oceans. Right? So he looked at the British Empire, now that they had that dominant navy. He even went all the way back to the Greeks and their control of the Mediterranean Sea. Right? So with that in mind, his argument is that if we want to be one of the great powers of the modern world, we've started the economic thing, if we want to be a political power of the world, we have to start kind of controlling the oceans. Right? What do you notice about a lot of those places that I just pointed out on the map that we're going to focus on? Do you know what you think? Yeah, right? They're a string of islands through the Pacific, many of which become, and still are today, United States naval stations. Right? And so Alfred Thayer Mahan was a very influential writer. Right? And there was a young Secretary of the Navy named Teddy Roosevelt who loved what Alfred Thayer Mahan was selling here. Right? And so this is the idea of imperialism will help our domestic problems politically, but will also make us a global power if we control the oceans based on the study of history. Well, the last one then is an economic, right? So what do we notice about the economy? Remember we played that game. What happened every 20 years despite the unprecedented economic growth of the late 1800s? Jacob, what happened every year, or 20 years? Yeah, we had two of the worst depressions in American history. During this time, it's supposed to be noted as this huge economic expansion, right? And all those panics have one thing in common. You overproduce, which means you don't have enough of a market to sell all these goods you're overproducing and overexpanding for. So what's the obvious solution that imperialism provides for you? What do you think, Kelly?
Find other markets.
Exactly, right? And who's at the end of that island chain is China. And what does China have a whole lot of? People. It's a huge market. As well as resources, right? If you want to continue to grow these industrialization, right? So there's two things that lead to this kind of economic theory of imperialism. One, like Frederick Jackson Turner said, the closing the frontier it's done. So there's this fear that all the resources that we had out west that seemed like they were endless because there was always this open land, that they might just dwindle away. So we've got to find new resources outside of our borders, these new frontiers. And then second, like Jacob was talking about, these depressions, right? That new markets, right, like China, would be the solution to solving the problem of depression, where we are always caused by overproduction and not a large enough market to sell the goods that are being produced by this new industrial economy. So we should notice now, right? There is a distinct social reason based on what we studied last unit. There's a distinct political reason based on what we studied last unit. And now there's a distinct economic reason. So even though we're kind of cutting off units, notice how they bleed into each other here. Right? And that the causes of this time period are still directly related to the past. Make sense? We got that argument? All right, good, because now you got to prove it. Right? So the rest of our class is about proving this argument. That this is what caused, right, American imperialism. And we're going to look at 4 case studies today. Right? We're going to start with Hawaii, because Hawaii today is just known as, this is a great place to go on vacation, man. Right? But we end this unit at Pearl Harbor in World War II, right? Well, we got to figure out why Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor did not pop up in 1941, right? It goes all the way back to 1887. But if we want to understand its significance, right? And that starts with Hawaii. And then we're going to look at Cuba, right? And the Spanish-American War. Then we're going to look at the Philippines, then we're going to look at China. And so for each case study, you're going to have to use that case study now to prove this argument, that the American people either saw expansion as needed because of the social issues of this country, the political issues of this country, or the economic issues. And we're going to see if one of these three seems to pop up more often. Because I'm going to ask you to rate, of these three topics, social, political, economic, which seems to be the biggest driving force when we look at these case studies. So let's start with our good friends in Hawaii. So some of us are geographically challenged, so we don't know where Hawaii is. It's right smack dab in the Pacific, right, Carissa? Yeah, right? And it's a series of islands, right, is Hawaii. You don't know. Carissa doesn't know where anything is. So just so. If you have a geography question, don't ask Carissa, right? Although she does claim that she can identify 14 of the United States on a map, which is pretty impressive, right? Yeah. All right, so let's start by looking at Hawaii. Now, Hawaii has a long history, right? So if we want to look at the history of involvement of the United States in Hawaii, we go all the way back to 1810. So 1810, realize Hawaii was actually a series of smaller kingdoms on each island, right? And these kingdoms constantly warred with one another. So the kind of main 7 islands were often at war with one another throughout the 1700s. Well, in 1810, they ended those tribal wars and became united under the leadership of King Kamehameha. And King Kamehameha, right, earned that unification by basically defeating one of his brothers in war, which then allowed him to kind of unite the whole kingdom under his leadership. Well, why he was able to do that was because American traders had been working with him for years, and they brought a lot of guns and ammunition to him, and it was through kind of the military force and the military kind of assets he gained from a lot of American traders that ultimately allowed him to overcome those other tribes on the different Hawaiian Islands. So as a result, once King Kamehameha takes control of the Hawaiian Islands in 1810, he's very welcoming to American traders, American merchants, starts selling land to American traders, so much so, right, that by the end of the 19th century, right, that the dominant economic force on the Hawaiian Islands are American sugar growers, right? So it started in the 1830s where the first American was able to buy land in Hawaii, and so by the 1890s, right, the Hawaiian Islands were dominated by American sugarcane plantations. They were owned by Americans, right? So they're the most powerful sources of economic strength on the island. And they had a great relationship with the American government. So in 1875, because of the dominant economic strength of these American sugar growers, the American government exempted Hawaiian-grown sugar from tariff laws. Why is that important? If you're a sugar grower, right, one of the most famous sugar growers on the Hawaiian Islands was a guy by the name of Sanford Dole, who his cousin starts a pineapple company a few years after this, right? So why is being exempted from tariff laws important for them? What do you think, Aubrey?
You can undercut your competition and have a monopoly.
Exactly, right? And so therefore, people will buy your sugar because they don't have to pay taxes on it, right? Even though Hawaii is not part of the United States. So as a result, right, these American sugar plantations import a lot of Asian workers, mostly from Japan and China. And so by the 1890s, when you combine the Asian workforce and the white plantation owners, the native Hawaiian presence in Hawaii has dwindled, right? Disease has dwindled it, right? A lot of similar themes to what happened to Native Americans, alcoholism, and a lot of the problems that came with kind of opening up to these Western countries. And so Hawaiians are starting to pretty much lose a grip on their islands by the 1870s and the 1880s, right? Now, on top of that, the American government not only is in control of the economic interests, but it's in 1887 that they signed the treaty that makes the Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, right, a U.S. naval base, right, where they get an agreement from, it's actually, I think, King Kamehameha III, who signs the treaty agreement to give access to the United States Navy to the island of Oahu for the naval base of Pearl Harbor. So by 1890, so by the time we get to the period we're studying, this is the situation. Right? So how does it move from this to become kind of full-throated imperialism? Well, it starts with this lady. This is Queen Liliuokalani. Right? She became queen in 1891. She was a descendant of King Kamehameha. Right? Yet she was a fierce nationalist. And she is going to try to resist a lot of the forces that are happening on the Hawaiian Islands. Right? And so she's going to try to resist the power of the sugar growers. She's going to try to resist kind of the dwindling of native influence on the native Hawaiian Islands. And so what she's going to do, so she'll be the last Hawaiian monarch, right, native Hawaiian monarch on the islands of Hawaii in the 1890s here. So she wanted Hawaii to be ruled only by native Hawaiians. So she will push through an act that will strip voting rights from any non-native Hawaiians. Who's obviously not going to like that too much? Yeah, the economic sugar plantation interests of the white plantation owners. So as a result, right, on top of that, when you double that with what occurred in 1890, right, the McKinley Tariff passed by a young congressman from Ohio named William McKinley, future president of the United States, right, basically stripped the Hawaiian sugar exemption from the tax codes of the United States government. So now why is that a double hit? So why is the ascension of Queen Liliuokalani and the McKinley Tariff, why is it a double hit for guys like Sanford Dole? Right? Why, Jacob?
Just because of the fact that, one, now that they don't really have that much power in Hawaii itself, and two, now that they're excluded from the American economy altogether.
Absolutely. So what would be a great solution for these guys? Yeah, so they've lost political power based on this kind of act passed by the Queen. They've lost economic power based on the McKinley Tariff of 1890. So what would be an obvious kind of solution in their eyes to their two dual problems here? What are you going to do? Seth, what are you going to do?
Gain political power.
Yeah. And how do you do that? Well, you just overthrow the Queen, which is what happens. So in 1893, the American planters, led by Sanford Dole, right, with help of the U.S. Marines that were stationed at Pearl Harbor, overthrow Queen Liliuokalani. They jail her, right? They strip her of power, and they create a new government, which is run by the sugar plantation owners on the islands of Hawaii. And the first thing they do as a new government is they rush an annexation order to Hawaii, or to Washington, excuse me, for Washington to annex Hawaii. What's that mean? If we annex Hawaii, what are we doing? Jacob, what are we doing?
You're taking it as the country.
Exactly, you're making it part of the country. Right? And now, why would they, obviously, so what's their true motivation for that annexation? So, what would we use that for? Robert, what do you think?
They don't want to have to pay the taxes.
Exactly, it's purely an economic motivation that we should see. Now, President Cleveland at the time is actually going to block this annexation order. And it's going to take about 5 years for it to fully come into play. We're going to come back to that later on. All right, so this is the history of American involvement in Hawaii, right, through the 1890s. So what part of our argument about the causes of American imperialism does it fit into nicely? The social, the political, or the economic? What do you think, Kylie?
Economic.
Why?
Because their whole point was to get around the tariff.
Absolutely, right? So this is an attempt by the sugar growers, mostly Americans, on the islands of Hawaii, to be able to sell sugar to the United States mainland without that tariff law interrupting it, right? So it's a huge motivating factor that will ultimately bring Hawaii into. But it's not the only one, as you're going to see, because we're not quite done with Hawaii. All right, so there's our first case study. Our second is going to revolve around a war, the Spanish-American War, which centers around American involvement in Cuba, right? And that's what we're going to focus on next. We're going to take a little bit more time with Cuba. And we're going to look at Cuba through two documents. And you've got them there in front of you. One is called the Teller Amendment, which was issued in 1898. One is called the Platt Amendment, which was issued in 1901. Because these two documents often give us kind of the historian's dilemma of what to believe and what to argue. Because these two documents disagree with one another. So we got to figure out which document to use that tells the real story of Cuba, right? All right, so let's start. So if we want to understand American involvement in Cuba and the Spanish-American War, this document tells us everything we need to know if we properly analyze it. So we're going to analyze it together here. right? Because again, you guys aren't bringing a lot of this information to the store. So let's start with our historical context. Let me add historical context to the Teller Amendment. I'm going to tell you everything that was happening on the island of Cuba by the 1890s in America. So Cuba was controlled by Spain. And by 1895, there's a growing Cuban revolutionary movement led by this guy named Jose Marti. Right? And Jose Marti will begin a revolt against their Spanish colonizers in 1895 in the countryside of Cuba. Well, this countryside of Cuba just happens to be kind of the foundation of sugar growing as well, much like in the Hawaiian Islands. Right? And much of these sugar plantations were heavily invested in by American business interests on the island of Cuba. So sugar is kind of important to this whole thing, apparently. Right? We need our sweet fix, is basically what this says. Well, to get the kind of attention of the world, Jose Marti and his revolutionaries begin to burn the sugar plantations in the countryside of the island of Cuba. Right? That this is the way that they are going to get the attention of the Americans as to the brutal nature of the treatment that they are under by the Spanish. Right? And so this kind of launches the Cuban Revolution in the 1890s as Spain is going to then roll in with a very heavy-handed response to the Cubans' burning of the countryside on the island of Cuba. And in an attempt to stamp it out, they send this guy in. A guy named General Valiano Weiler. The American media will label him the Butcher, right? And here's why. Because the tactics that Valiano Weiler will use to subdue the revolution is by cutting off the population from the revolutionaries. So what they created were basically concentration camps. They call them reconcentration camps. So if you don't allow the Cuban revolutionaries to have access to the population, the revolution can't grow. Let me show you a couple images from those concentration camps, right? These are Cuban civilians living in the Spanish concentration camps under General Valiano Weiler, right? So if I just showed you the images, we would probably think it's from the event that ends this unit in World War II, right? So it was by no means, right, a kind treatment to the Spanish people, or excuse me, to the Cuban people by the Spanish government, right? And so this is going to start to get the attention of the United States, right? As a result, what the United States will do, because they have economic interests in the island of Cuba, right? They're not really keen on what's going on in the countryside, especially the burning of these sugar plantations. So in 1898, right, President William McKinley is going to start to kind of pay attention. Well, what will enrage now the United States in its relationship with Spain is this guy, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, who was a Spanish ambassador to the United States. Right? And in 1898, he is going to send a letter home to Spain from the United States that criticizes President William McKinley as a weak politician who doesn't have a backbone to do anything about Spanish rule in Cuba. This letter was intercepted and immediately published in William Randolph Hearst's newspaper in New York City, right? Because at that time, the New York City newspapers, one led by Joseph Pulitzer, one by William Randolph Hearst, were in a massive circulation battle. They wanted people to buy their newspapers. So they would write these sensationalistic stories, right, about especially what was happening in Cuba. It's called yellow journalism, where they'd take something that had a kernel of truth to it and then just blow it up into this sensationalistic story. So in other words, these two men really wanted there to be a war. Why? If you own a newspaper, why do you really want there to be a war? Right? Justice, what do you think?
Because then everyone's going to be curious about all the news.
Yep. And they're going to buy your newspaper. So these guys are just as important to understanding the start of this war as well, as they're going to inflame every minor thing. And one of them was this letter sent by Enrique Dupuy de Lome. Because the fact of the matter is, the things that de Lome said in that letter are no different than what other Republicans said about William McKinley. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt was quoted as saying that William McKinley had no more of a backbone than a chocolate eclair. Which I don't know if you know, those are, it's a cream-filled donut. They don't have a whole lot of backbone, right? And so there's really not much to this, but they blew it up way out of proportion. So it was in this context, right, that probably the most important incident happened. It involved the USS Maine. So the USS Maine was sent to the harbor of Havana by the United States in February of 1898 to kind of just look over what was going on, to kind of keep an eye on what was occurring on the island of Cuba, right? To calm American interests, to calm tensions, because there was a lot of American investment on the island of Cuba. And so McKinley sends the ship, and only a few weeks into its trip, it blows up, right? So there's the artist portrayal that was portrayed in one of Hearst's newspapers, right? And this leads to a huge call to arms. It becomes known as Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And most of that was induced by Pulitzer and Hearst's newspapers, right? As they immediately printed that the Spanish had done this, that this was a Spanish mine. The fact of the matter is, down the line, research has shown that it was probably an internal explosion, most notably done because of the coal-burning engines where they had ammunition stored right next to it, right? But regardless, it kills over 260 American servicemen, right? And this becomes now one of the most important calls to war, especially by the Pulitzer and Hearst newspapers in New York City, right? To go to war with Spain over the island of Cuba. All right, so with that in mind, there's our historical context of this document. So let's read this document together here, and let's kind of identify then the point of view, right? Identify the purpose of this document, and let's see how it fits into then our argument about American imperialism by 1898. All right, so we need a volunteer. Before we do, though, let's figure out the point of view. So this is called the Teller Amendment of 1898. Who most likely wrote this document? What point of view does it represent? It's an amendment. Thank you, Allison. Yeah, what part of the government do you think? What's that? Yeah, Congress, right? Now why? Knowing all of that that's going on, right, what power does Congress have that they still used in this time period? What do you think that?
They have to approve of war.
Exactly, right? So this is written from the perspective of Congress, right? So we know that this is an important step then in a declaration of war against Spain regarding all these things that we just talked about. All right, let's see why then. So what their argument is that they make. All right, let's get some volunteers to read. So who's going to be our Teller Amendment reader for document 1 here? Thank you, Jacob. Take it away.
Whereas the abhorrent conditions which have existed for more than 3 years in the island of Cuba, so near our own borders, have shocked the moral sense of the people of the United States, have been a disgrace to Christian civilization, culminating as they have in the destruction of a United States battleship, with 266 of its officers and crew, while on a friendly visit in the harbor of Havana, and can no longer be endured, and has been set forth by the President of the United States in his message to Congress of April 11, 898, upon which the action of Congress was invited.
All right, stop there. So what historical context do they reference that we just kind of rolled through? Seth, what do they reference?
The USS Maine.
Yeah, the USS Maine. What else do they reference in there? The abhorrent conditions. What else, Tom?
The concentration camps.
Yeah, right? So yeah, the treatment of guys like Spanish General Valiano Weyler and the concentration camps and the Cuban population. So in other words, right, we know that this is probably a step towards a declaration of war. Who is to blame in the eyes of the United States Congress for this whole thing? Who's the justice? Spain. Absolutely, right? Never mind the fact that we're not even sure if they blew up the ship, right? It's their fault. Okay. So, what's that mean then about the purpose? All right, Jacob, pick it up there when you're ready.
Therefore, resolve first that the people of the island of Cuba are of right ought to be free and independent. Second, that it is the duty of the United States to demand, and the government of the United States does hereby demand, that the government of Spain at once relinquish its authority and government in the island of Cuba and withdraw its land and naval forces from Cuba and Cuban waters. Third, that the President of the United States be, and he hereby is, directed and empowered to use the entire land and naval forces of the United States and to call into the actual service of the United States the militia of several states, to such extent as may be necessary to carry these resolutions into effect. Fourth, that the United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island except for the pacification, and asserts its determination when that is accomplished to leave the government in control of the island to its people.
All right, thank you, Jacob. So let's kind of organize now the purpose of this, right? So let's answer these two questions. So we know now that this document is in essence what? Yeah, it's a declaration of war, right? So it's a congressional declaration of war based on what the President of the United States, William McKinley, was asking for that they referenced in this. Okay, so now why does Congress, who wrote this document, feel we have to go to war? So first off, what reasons do they give us as to why Spain has given us no choice? What have they done that says why we have to go to war? So Dale, what did they do?
They shocked the moral sense of the people of the U.S. with concentration camps.
Okay, good, right? So yeah, all these stories that the American people are reading in their newspapers about the Butcher, Valiano, Weiler, and these concentration camps. And then what else did they do? Yeah, they attacked us, right, Justice? Yeah. Now, I want you to remember this, because this is where we start the trend of every war seems to start with some sort of American ship getting blown up, right? And so remember this, right? There's a trend that's going to develop, and this is one of the first of those trends. All right, so yeah, they attacked the USS Maine, even though future evidence tells us it probably didn't happen that way. But they didn't know that at that time, right? They believed it was the Spanish, right? They are being brutal to the Cuban people, so it's all Spain's fault. However, what's the United States? What's the only thing the United States wants out of this war, according to this document? Right? Joey, think.
They just want the Cuban people to be free for themselves.
Exactly. We just want the Cubans to be free. And then once that happens, what does this document say we're going to do? Yeah, we're just going to go. Because that's how much we love freedom. Right? Is that we are going to free the Cubans and then leave. Well, if we think about that, this doesn't seem to match imperialism, does it? Why? So if this document is true, why does this not match the concept of imperialism at all? Kyle, what do you think? Yeah, there's nothing we're gaining out of this. There's no control we're gaining out of this. It's we're saying, we just love freedom so much that Cuban people, we want you to experience it too. Get those nasty Spanish out of there, right, is what he's saying. So that should already bring up some red flags as to whether we truly trust this document, right? And so let's fast forward now 3 years to 1901. So that was at the beginning of the war. Well, now this is going to fast forward to after the war. Let's look at another document, the Platt Amendment, written in 1901. So here's another amendment. So who do we think is the point of view of this document then? That's Congress again. Same point of view. So we're going to look at a different audience and a different purpose and a different context out of this one. So let's start with now the historical context. So if the Teller Amendment was before the Spanish-American War, and it was all about the reasons why we're about to go to war with Spain over the island of Cuba in 1898, this is after the war. And let's fill in the gaps as to what happened in between. So let me fill in the historical context then of the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War was titled by the Secretary of State, John Hay, as a splendid little war. Right? And here's why he called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war. One, it started on April 25th of 1898 and ended on August of 1898. It was super short, right? And in fact, it was not much of a war. Only 460 Americans die from combat. 5,200, though, die of disease, right? And what this shows us is it wasn't much of a war. The United States military was so ill-prepared for a global conflict at this time, right, that disease shows us that. It was a war predominantly fought by National Guard troops, because we didn't have a strong central military. They had horrible preparation. They didn't have the equipment. We sent them down to the Caribbean in the summer, right, wearing wool uniforms. I don't know if you've ever been to the Caribbean in the summer. Wool is not what you want to wear, right? They got to the island of Cuba. They had no way to really unload all their supplies. So troops just started jumping overboard, right? They were pushing horses overboard, right? And just swimming in. Well, heavy wool uniforms as you're swimming in the ocean, right, don't work. So many of the soldiers just took their uniforms off. So we really invaded Cuba with a bunch of naked guys just kind of wandering around the shores, right? So in other words, right, why this was able to succeed is because Spain was not much of a resistance at this point. Their empire was this is like kind of the dying throes of what was once hundreds of years earlier a great empire, right? But they weren't much of a resistance at this point in time. However, it was also splendid, despite the fact that we were totally ill-prepared, right? It kind of created new heroes. One of those new heroes is Teddy Roosevelt, pictured center there. So Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy. He resigned that post to make a battalion that he titled the Rough Riders, which were basically made up of a bunch of cowboys. They actually came up with the idea of this while drinking at a bar in San Antonio, Texas. And they said, hey, let's do this. And then they did, right? And they were kind of memorialized, right, and celebrated in the newspapers in New York for the charge up San Juan Hill, which was a bit of a reckless charge. As of those 400 Americans that died, about 100 of them died at the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt as they charged up this hill. Right? So he was responsible for about 25% of the American casualties in the war with this. But it made him into this kind of cult hero in the United States, right? Kind of this new war hero. And it will vault him in 1900 to become the Vice President of the United States based on his heroism in the war. But it also was kind of a military reunification of the North and South. This is a very famous picture from 1898, right, where Cuba, represented by the little girl, right, is freed thanks to the reunification of the Union and the Confederacy. Right? So this whole idea that the North and the South, for the first time since the end of the Civil War, reunite. Right? And so the government views this as a splendid little war. Now, it had its issues. Right? A lot of the troops that fought in this were actually African American. Right? They were brought from the West to fight in the Caribbean. And it created a lot of racial tension at the camps, because many of the camps, the launching point of this war was Tampa Bay, Florida. And the South is deeply segregated, as we know, by the 1890s. So there's a ton of tension within, as well as the fact a lot of the Cuban rebels were black. Right? So there was a lot of things going on here behind the scenes. Right? However, it was an easy victory, right? That was won and had some kind of symbolic consequences to it. So now, as a result of this war, this is how we know it was a real war, because we haven't had one of these in a while. We have not had a Treaty of Paris in quite some time, right? So we're back to signing treaties in Paris to end wars, right? So the Treaty of Paris in 1898 will end this war. Well, pay close attention now to what the Treaty of Paris said versus what we said in the Teller Amendment, right? Because we were only going, what was the only thing we wanted out of this war according to the Teller Amendment? Justice, what was it? Yeah, free the Cubans. Well, here's what the Treaty of Paris did. It did free the Cubans. However, Spain also gave Puerto Rico and the island of Guam to the United States. Oh yeah, and on top of that, the United States paid $20 million for the island of the Philippines. What's this say about the sincerity of the Teller Amendment right off the bat? Thanks, Seth.
It was really had a background in imperialistic tendencies.
Yeah, right? So if the Teller Amendment was 100% true, we would just stop there, right?
Yeah.
It would just be that first one. That's the only thing in the Treaty of Paris. But instead, we gained land. We gained Puerto Rico. We gained Guam, right? We paid $20 million for the Philippines. And oh yeah, by the way, right, we also annexed Hawaii as a result of the Spanish-American War, because Hawaii was a great launching point for the attack on the Philippines. In fact, the first shots of the Spanish-American War were not fired in Havana, in Cuba. They were fired some 2,000 miles away in Manila Bay at the Philippines by this guy, Commodore George Dewey, who becomes admiral due to his assault on the city of Manila in Manila Bay in the Philippines. What does that now tell us about the Teller Amendment? That we're only going to war to free the Cuban people. If we had to free the Cuban people, did we have to attack the Philippines 2,000 miles away? Probably not much correlation there, right? So we should start to see that maybe, just maybe, the Teller Amendment doesn't tell us much about American imperialism, right? So this is the outcome of the Spanish-American War. In other words, the United States gains a lot of territory from this war, right? Well, now let's get back to Cuba, though. Because after the war, American military forces remained in Cuba until 1902. And in that meantime, they built roads, they built schools, they built hospitals. They reorganized the entire Cuban system. They reorganized the legal system, the financial system, and the administrative system. All the while, the Cubans are writing their own constitution because they've been freed, right? American investors will come in, right? So by the 1950s, Havana is like Las Vegas is today, right? Lots of American investors in it, right? They invested in railroads and factories, sugar plantations, hotels, right? Things like that. And all the while, the Cubans started to write a constitution that made no reference to the United States, right? Because, they thought they were free, right? All right, so this is the context of the Platt Amendment that we're about to read here, right? So the Spanish-American War was fought, very little resistance from Spain, a lot of resistance because of the disarray of the American military and disease that killed off 5,000 Americans during the war, right? A treaty that ended the war that saw the United States gain Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, even though we said we were just in it for the freedom of the Cuban people, and an American military presence still in Cuba rebuilding the country while the Cubans are writing their own constitution. All right, so now let's go back to the Platt Amendment. And let's look at the point of view and the purpose. And we know that this is written by the United States Congress again. So let's look at the purpose. So who's my volunteer to read us the Platt Amendment out loud here then? Take it on, Zoltan.
Okay. Shall define the future relations of the United States with Cuba substantially as follows. That the government of Cuba shall never enter into any treaty or other compact with any foreign power or powers which will impair or tend to impair the independence of Cuba, nor in any manner authorize or permit any foreign power or powers to obtain by colonization or for military or naval purposes or otherwise lodgment in or control over any portion of said island. 3. That the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence. That to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba and to protect the people thereof, as well as for its own defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling the naval stations at certain specified points to be agreed upon with the President of the United States.
All right, so let's just jump right off here. What's different about this document versus the first document? What are the key differences if we compare the Teller Amendment with the Platt Amendment? What do you think, Jill?
You're saying that if anything impairs Cuba's freedom, America has a right to step in.
Yeah, we can just kind of intervene, right? And to ensure that we have the right to intervene, what is Cuba being forced to do for the United States? Kind of everything.
Give us like land whenever.
Yeah, give us land, right? Yeah, we need some coaling stations there, and we want a military base. Anyone know what that military base is still today? It's Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, right? Which is a kind of notorious prison camp for terror suspects on the island of Cuba today. We still own that strip of land at Guantanamo Bay today. All right, so what is obviously different then? So the Teller Amendment said, what again? What's the only thing we want to give the Cubans? Just so it? Yeah, is this actual freedom? No. So then what's the purpose of this document? Knowing all of that historical context, what are the Cubans doing that obviously the United States doesn't agree with at this point in time? So what were they doing? What do you think, Joe?
They're forming their own constitution, which no mention of.
Exactly, right? So in other words, the Platt Amendment is an attempt by the United States Congress to do what to the Cuban Constitution? What's the purpose of this then? What do you think, Harrison?
Force America on their constitution.
Yeah, they're going to force the Cubans to add this to their constitution, right? This idea that the Americans can intervene in Cuba whenever we want. We get land, right, for military and coaling purposes. And oh yeah, Cuba, you can't sign an agreement with any other country in the world but us, right? Well, if you don't know, there's still a lot of tension today between the United States and Cuba. And here is step one in that tension, right? Is this document compared with the Teller Amendment, right? Okay, so we put it all together then. Here's our dilemma as a historian. So we have to try to figure out then how the Spanish-American War fits into this concept of imperialism. We have two different documents that tell us two very different things about the Spanish-American War. So which document do we trust? Which document will we focus on in our analysis and our argument about the true intentions of the United States when it comes to the Spanish-American War? Jacob, what do you think?
The Platt Amendment.
Okay, why?
Just because of the fact that it's more corresponds with the actions of the United States, especially with the attacking of the Philippines and the annexation of several other lands through the Treaty of Paris.
Okay. So it seems to match the motivations when you look at the Treaty of Paris and the fact that we're gobbling up islands like Hawaii and Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. It seems to match that. But wait a minute, the Teller Amendment matched the history I talked about. Spain putting Cubans into concentration camps, the USS Maine blowing up. So what is it about a document before the war and a document after the war that might make us trust the document after the war more than before the war? Right? What do you think, Nasser?
Because before the war shows like the intentions they display, but afterwards it shows what really occurred.
Okay, it's like the actuality of the outcomes, right? Yeah, and now why? Why might, before a war, why might Congress have this kind of beautifully worded thing about freedom and things like that? What do you think, Megan?
Because they want to get people on the side of the war.
Absolutely.
They have what is in like the Platt Amendment, then people are going to be like, this is like alternate like reasonings.
Exactly, right? And the fact of the matter is that most of the fighting in the Spanish-American War was done by the Cubans, right? The Americans really just supported much of the Cuban revolutionaries. So if we would have come out in the Teller Amendment and said, hey, we need to fight this war because, man, it's a great spot for a military base for the United States and some coaling, and we can invest in sugar plantations, would the Cuban people fight for that? Probably not, right? But freedom for the Cuban people. Heck yeah, sign me up. But once the deed is done, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to have this coaling station and this military base, right, to kind of add to all this other land that we got, right, as a result of the Spanish-American War. So in other words then, so if we're going to focus on the Platt Amendment and all that historical context that connects to the Platt Amendment as American imperialism of Cuba, as well as the other island chains, then what's this then say about those arguments we made at the beginning? So what argument does this match pretty well that we made at the beginning about the causes of imperialism? And why? Thanks, Seth. What's one?
The stabilized domestic politics.
Yeah, why?
Teller Amendment, where basically you paint like a photo that we're just gonna fight for their freedoms. So
Yeah.
you can like qualm some of the infighting, because like everyone, especially Americans, like, yeah, I'll support that.
Yeah, it did that too, right? Brought Northerners and Southerners together again. African Americans fighting in this war. Yeah, it really was an attempt to stabilize domestic politics, the Spanish-American War, without a doubt. What other argument can we make about the reasons for imperialism? Nasser, what else?
The economic intentions,
Yeah.
because they wanted to develop railroads and
Yeah.
sugar plantations.
They just pour investment in, right? And much like the Hawaiian Islands were a center of sugar production, so were the Cuban. So was the island of Cuba, right? As well as all this other infrastructure that American industries and American financiers are investing in, right? Absolutely, that's another one. Now, what's a third possibility that we talked about at the beginning? Ben, what do you think?
The U.S. still wants to like control lesser people
Mm-hmm.
and spread our free culture.
Exactly, right? That concept of controlling the lesser, right, is a big part of it. The Cubans weren't allowed to sit at the negotiations for the Treaty of Paris. Only the United States and Spain did, right? The Cubans are writing their own constitution without the Americans mentioned. Oh yeah, you're going to mention us, and we have all this control, right? So we see that aspect of it as well, right? Okay, so on top of that, there's probably one more argument we can make that makes the Spanish-American War a great piece of evidence. Think about the fact that we annexed Hawaii. We took Manila Bay, the Philippines, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, right? What do you think, Megan?
We're establishing kind of like our naval dominance. in the
Yeah.
area.
And why? What did we learn at the beginning under our argument as to why we would want to do that? What was the argument as to why you want to establish naval dominance? Why, Seth?
Those who control the ocean.
Yeah, so there's that kind of wanting to step into the world stage as a political power as well. So the Spanish-American War is the best symbol of American imperialism. Even though the document that started it seems like, no, we're just doing this for you guys, right? We should see that it was kind of a different story than that. Does that make sense? All right, good. Well, we're not done though, right? Because now that we know that the Treaty of Paris brought in all these other island chains, well, let's look at one of those other island chains. And let's start with the Philippines, right? Because this is going to be one of the most controversial aspects of American foreign policy during this time period are the islands of the Philippines. Because now these islands, whereas Cuba is 90 miles away, right? Even Hawaii, it's off our western coast, right? The Philippines is in an entire different region of the world, right? And so Americans are a little, uneasy about the Philippines. So when we look at the Philippines, right? The United States is going to control the Philippines and step in right as Spain is leaving. And as a result, a guy by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo, this is him right there, right? A noted Filipino leader who actually fought with the Americans against the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, will now force a resistance against the American entrance into the Philippines. And this, whereas the Spanish-American War was not much of a war, the Filipino War that ensues is brutal. Right? It is fierce fighting. Over 200,000 American troops will be put into the islands of the Philippines by 1899 to subdue this uprising of the Filipinos led by Emilio Aguinaldo. Right? And why, obviously, would the Filipinos revolt against American entrance into their islands? What do you think they hoped to gain from the Spanish-American War that now they're realizing they're not getting? Right? What do you think, Kylie? Yeah, they wanted independence as well. And so as the Americans enter, they realize they're not going to get it. And they start what becomes known as a guerrilla warfare. What's that mean, guerrilla warfare? Seth, what's that mean?
Guerrilla warfare, it's not like two great forces on each other. You have small, faction almost.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's almost like an insurgent war, right? So you're not fighting a traditional military. Right? So villagers from around the island chains of the Philippines start rising up against American military, right? And as a result, the American military tactics become quite brutal. So we put in over 200,000 American troops into the island of the Philippines over several years, right? And as a result, one of the tactics they start to take is the same thing the Spanish were doing to the Cubans. They start to round up villages and put them into concentration camps. They start to destroy whole villages because they don't know who they're fighting against, like this village here, right? Done by American troops. So why, obviously, might some American people be uneasy with this concept? You think, Jillian?
It seems like hypocrisy.
Yeah, why?
Well, you go and make this big deal about how the Spanish are causing a massive injustice down in Cuba, and then you do the exact same thing in the Philippines.
Absolutely, right? And so the American people start to question, well, why? So why do this? Why try to annex the Philippines? Well, this debate rages in the United States, and here is a response by Senator Albert Beveridge from Connecticut in response to this question. He says this: why we need to do this is because the Philippines are ours forever. And just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. What do you think he means by that? So, in other words, what is this senator saying plain as day as to why we would go into the Philippines, put our presence there, fight with military force? Why, Tom?
Access to China's markets.
Exactly, right? Because China's got a lot of people, right? So in other words, then, if we look at this statement and the use of American military in the Philippines between 1899 and 1901 to brutally subdue this kind of resistance by the Filipino people led by Emilio Aguinaldo, right? This matches which part of our argument from the beginning of class? Yeah, it's a huge economic argument, right? That we need the markets that come along with it. All right, so then let's talk about China, right? So if China is linked to the Philippines, well then, let's understand China. Actually, I took the document out from that, so we're going to skip that, right? So what should we know about China at this time period? Well, China is already imperialized, right? Because China looks like this. So you have different spheres of imperialization in China by several world powers. You got the British, the French, the Japanese, who are the only Asian countries to kind of prevent being imperialized in this era because they became the imperializers themselves, right? And did much of that themselves. The Germans, the Russians are all already in China. So what do you think the United States wants to do with this situation as a result? What do you think, Kylie?
They probably want to get their own little piece.
Yeah, maybe get their own little piece. But if they can't get their own little piece, what do they want to make sure these countries don't do to them? I mean, Seth?
Cut them out from the market.
Yeah, don't shut us out, right? And that becomes the policy in China. It becomes known as Secretary of State John Hay's open door notes. where he sends a series of messages to the English, the Germans, the French, the Russians, the Italians, the Japanese. And what each message said was, hey, all of those nations, you guys that have a sphere of influence already, allow other nations to come in and trade freely as well, right? And so in other words, what's the only thing we want out of China when you look at this open door policy that our government is trying to pursue? What do we want? Tom, what do we want?
The ability to trade with them.
Exactly. We want to sell stuff to them, right? They've got a lot of people. We consistently overproduce, which causes these panics. Let's dump all that excess overproduction on China. We're good, right? It's this kind of frontier of a massive market, right? It's kind of the opposite of today, right? We want to dump our cheap goods on them, right? Rather than them dumping their cheap goods on us, right? So think of it as the total reverse of our modern relationship with China, right? Is what it looks like. Okay, so how do we know that that's what they want? Well, about a year after this, the Chinese people revolt in what becomes known as the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers were a group of Chinese nationalists who severely wanted to rid China of all foreign influence, right? And so they were named the Boxers because all these Western people, they were trained in martial arts, right? In kind of ancient Chinese martial arts. And so, of course, all these Westerners are like, hey, look at those Boxers, right? Doing all those crazy things with their hands, right? And so they called it the Boxer Rebellion. And so these nationalists start to kind of raid cities where Western influence was there, Beijing being one of the big ones. They start killing Catholic and Christian missionaries throughout the country to try to rid all foreign influence from China. And the response, right, is that an international force gets together, including the United States. So the United States, Russia, Germany, Britain, France, all get together and brutally suppress the Boxer Rebellion. And why? What do all of them have in common? Because just 14 years after this, what are these countries all going to do to each other? Yet they're going to kill each other in large quantities, right, in World War I. Yet, in 1900, they're all on the same side to defeat the Chinese Boxer Rebellion. And why? What's the only reason why the United States would take part in this as well? Megan, why?
They all had the same motive of like the markets.
Exactly. They wanted those Chinese markets, right? So why then, if we look at the Philippines and now China, right, what's the big motive that just is jumping to the forefront of American imperialism in this time period from that argument we laid out at the beginning of class? What do we see, Seth?
Resource and market.
Exactly, right? Those resources, those markets. It's huge influence on American imperialism. All right, so if we look at this all said and told then, right? We should now have a significant argument about the causes of American imperialism with key pieces of evidence. And I know I went through it quickly. Are there any questions? All right, well, if we're going to talk about causes, then we've got to talk about effects, right? So if we're looking at these are the causes, well, then let's lay out a couple of effects. Let's start with effect number one, right? And our first effect that we're going to look at is this concept of a pluralistic society. Well, why is that important? So remember, that was one of the big questions that I posed to us. How does the United States continue to become a more pluralistic society? So why, from everything we just discussed, why does imperialism help answer part of that question? What are obviously going to be the ultimate effects that will help lead to a more pluralistic society in the United States? Justice, what do you think?
Well, I mean, when you're taking over all these countries, you're getting different people. So
Yeah.
Samoans, Asians.
Exactly. You're bringing in large numbers of different people, right? So think about it, right? By 1917, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico all become U.S. territories, right? And so therefore, you're bringing in these diverse populations, right, of Latino people with Spanish heritage, right? Like Justice said, Asian workers in the Hawaiian Islands, Native Hawaiians, right? Native Alaskans, right? You're bringing in all these different groups, even Russian traders that were up in Alaska, right, into society. And not only, many of them become citizens. The example is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is the classic example of how territorial status leads to citizenship status. So in 1900, the Foraker Act in Puerto Rico ended military rule in Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War. And by 1917, the United States government put into place called the Jones Act, which granted all Puerto Ricans, even though they just have territorial status, American citizenship, which still stands today. You paid attention to current events over the summer with the hurricanes and everything like that ravaged the island of Puerto Rico, right? So this is a huge effect, kind of that growth of a pluralistic society. You're bringing in a diverse population as you expand into these new lands. I'll leave that up for a second. Okay, so there's effect number one. The second effect is going to deal with the military. Because what did I say about the military in the Spanish-American War? Yeah, not real good. But we still won, right? But there was a lot of lessons learned there. So our second effect, then, is kind of the creation of a much more modern military. And this political cartoon shows us, right? It shows in the background, that's a British naval ship, and in the foreground is the U.S. naval ship, right? And so this concept is that if we had to fight a real world power in the Spanish-American War, we would have got our stuff handed to us, right? And it would not have happened as well. Thankfully, we fought this half-hearted empire, the Spanish, right, who were pretty much on the verge of giving up anyways. So as a result, President William McKinley, following the Spanish-American War, will enlarge the American military. Prior to this point in time, the standing military is only 25,000 troops. After this point in time, it grows to 100,000, which is still really small, as you're going to see, compared to other global powers by the time we get to World War I. Right? They start to improve their naval ships by replacing them with modern steel naval ships. Well, who loves that we learned about last semester or last unit? Jay, who loves it? Yeah, this is going to grow Carnegie's company and be one of the biggest contracts Carnegie gets that ultimately allows him to sell his company to J.P. Morgan for like $400 million, right? Is the contracts to rebuild the U.S. Navy, right? On top of that, this idea, if you pay attention to politics, today we have what's called the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the heads of all the military branches who report to the president and the executive branch. Well, that was created as a result of the Spanish-American War, right, to kind of have a more efficient military system in terms of these. So that's another kind of change in the way our government works. So that's a big part of the question we looked at, is the changes in our kind of political system and our foreign policy. But the biggest one we're going to look at are these two documents that we're going to look at on our way out the door today. Because probably the most important effect of this is political disagreement. Not everyone liked what we were doing in this time period. So we're going to look at two cartoons. They're two of my favorites, right, of this time period. And I could have pulled out dozens and dozens more. And let's analyze these to see what political debate will rage as a result of imperialism. So let's start with this one. Right? So this one's titled The Filipinos' First Bath. Right? And so in the middle here, that's William McKinley. Right? It was published in 1899. So William McKinley in 1899 was what? He's the President of the United States, right? And here he is giving this Filipino child a bath. What do you notice about the way the artist has portrayed the little Filipino baby in this picture? Right? What do you notice, Justice? Exactly, right? They have this very native kind of look to him, right? And why might that be? So what do we know about the historical context of what's happening in the Philippines at the time of the publication of this magazine? Seth, what do you think?
They're like being deemed lesser people.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's kind of some of the motivation.
Exactly, right? And what did the U.S. military do as a result of this belief in them as the lesser? Right? What did I describe when I described the interaction between the United States military and the people of the Philippines during this uprising in the Philippines? What sorts of actions did the United States government take? What do you think, Ari?
They put them into like reconcentration camps.
Exactly, right? They treated them as lesser people, just like the Native Americans, right? Full-on like massacres, right? Kind of pinning them into small territories, right? They took almost the exact same approach to the Filipinos that we took towards the Native Americans in the West just a decade earlier from this document. All right, and then on top of that, so McKinley's given this little native boy a bath, and he's saying, "Oh, you dirty boy." And around the water is this concept of civilization. So why? So what argument then is this artist making about that context of the Filipino War? Right? So why are we doing it? Jill, what do you think? Exactly. So in other words, does this artist agree or disagree with what's happening in the Philippines? He agrees wholeheartedly, right? That this is what you have to do to civilize lesser people, right? All right, now, if we notice in the back, there's two guys getting dressed in their American outfits back there, right? One guy is labeled Cuba, and one guy is labeled Puerto Rico. Now, why do you think that those two guys have already gotten their bath? And they're already getting dressed. Why, Nasser, why?
Following like concrete them, it shows them like happy, it shows that like it works, they got civilized.
Exactly. We help these people. We don't harm these people. We're bringing civilization to them based on our interactions with the Filipinos, right? Despite the violence, right, and the atrocities that are emerging, it's all for them. So what's that say about the point of view of this document? So what point of view would we assign to this, right? What do you think, Brittany?
There's the idea of like social Darwinism.
Very much so, right? Yeah. And when you combine social Darwinism with international expansion, it becomes known as jingoism, right? This aggressive expansion based on the concept of social Darwinism. So in other words, right, when the American people are debating whether or not what we are doing in the Philippines is the right thing, this jingoistic point of view says it's the right thing because we're bringing civilization to these people. We're bettering this society, right? Okay, so there's one side of our argument, but it's only one side of the argument. Because on the flip side of that argument is our second cartoon, right? So if our second cartoon then takes a little bit of a different perspective on it, right? And this one's called Fun for the Boys, right? All published about a year later in 1900, right? So let's kind of explore this one, because there's a lot going on in this document that I absolutely love, but also is a great kind of symbol of what's going on. All right, so at the top here, we have on the chalkboard the Declaration of Independence, but it's obviously being edited, right? And so at the top of it is the edit that says this: the Declaration of Dependence. We bought the Filipinos for $20 million. Therefore, right? All right, well, $20 million, what's that a reference to? What did we learn earlier in class that that's a reference to? Seth, what's that a reference to? Exactly, through the Treaty of Paris in 1898, right? So, in other words, this person is saying, hey, we bought the Philippines, so here's what we can do. So then they've edited the Declaration of Independence that says this: therefore, we hold these lies to be self-evident, that all brown men are created unequal, that they are endowed by their, I think it's colonizers, I can't remember exactly what it said, with certain unalienable wrongs, that among these are death, captivity, and pursuit. Right? To secure these wrongs, governments are instituted among Filipinos, deriving their just powers from the consent of the... I can't read that last part. And then at the bottom it says, it's signed, Old Daddy Washington is a has-been, signed me, Mac, and Teddy. So what's the obvious argument that this artist is making about the Treaty of Paris and our treatment of the Filipino people in this Filipino uprising? Kylie, what are they making?
They're making a point of how bad it is.
Yeah, it's really bad. But what, beyond just being bad, why use symbolism of the Declaration of Independence? Old Daddy Washington was a has-been, and we have this nondescript founding father in the background looking a bit concerned, right? Why, Aubrey?
We're breaking from our moral beliefs of the country. I can't speak.
Absolutely. This does not match who we are as a country.
Yeah.
This does not match our founding beliefs. That the founders would be appalled at what we are doing in the Philippines. Isn't that the argument here? Right? And not only what we are doing, but who's doing. So who are these three guys then? Me, Mac, and Teddy. Who are me, Mac, and Teddy? Right? What do you think?
So it's Teddy Roosevelt
Mhm.
and me. I don't know who.
This is most likely William Howard Taft, who is the governor of the Philippines, who was placed there by President William McKinley, who called all the Filipinos his little brown friends, right? Is what he said about them at one point in time, right? Okay, so in other words, what is the purpose of this? So this point of view is saying that the actions of our president, and ultimately our vice president, as Teddy Roosevelt, made to look like a Rough Rider, becomes vice president based on that, right? Their actions go against the founding beliefs of who we are, right? So why do you think they're making this argument? what's the purpose then? What are they trying to gain, right? Or what are they trying to stop, maybe? What do you think, Nasser?
Perhaps to show the people the hypocrisy of the government so that they can act for the
Yeah, and most notably the Philippines itself, right? The Philippines was the most heated debate during the imperialist era, right? That people just could not accept what we were doing so many thousands of miles away from our own borders, right? And so it was a tremendously heated point of view. Now let's add to it the point of view. So this point of view is from a member of the Anti-Imperialist League, right? And the Anti-Imperialist League was a diverse group that opposed annexation to the Philippines. Now let me tell you who were members of the Anti-Imperialist League. Mark Twain was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. William Jennings Bryan was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. Andrew Carnegie was a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. Let's think of those last two then. William Jennings Bryan and Andrew Carnegie. Do those two guys have much in common? Why not? What did we learn about those two guys last unit? Right? What do you think, Seth?
So William Jennings Bryan did the speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he didn't want the gold standard, and then the industrialist Carnegie was obviously the opposition to that.
Absolutely, right? So yeah, William Jennings Bryan was speaking out against the control these industrialists had in the government. Carnegie, obviously one of those industrialists. But here they are, merged together. Why is that an important point, do you think, when you talk about one of the biggest effects is this political debate? Meg, what do you think?
Because it almost like unifies some of the people that you would think would not be unified.
Absolutely, right? So they're so appalled at what they see as imperialism going against the founding values of the United States that they unify. In fact, Carnegie offers $20 million of his own dollars to buy the Philippines from the United States government to set them free. Right? They don't take him up on that offer, right? So obviously then, if we look at these two together, right? So what do we notice is a big effect, was one of the things we talked about in the founding of our start of our unit. Was there any agreement on the policies of imperialism at home? There was a deep divide. Yet, of these two arguments, which one really won in the end? Yeah, the kind of the jingoistic pro-imperialist one did. Right, as the Philippines were annexed. Right, these things did carry on. But we should notice that it's not without deep, deep debate. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Look at that, right on time. So if you notice, I think I answered every question on that on your reading sheet, right?